Hold on to your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy Freaks and Geeks, what is up? Welcome to Week 16. It's championship weekend in fantasy football. Hopefully for you, it's the last weekend of your league. Anybody that plays in Week 17, you need to change that for next year. We got our first game of the week on Christmas night. Merry Christmas to all. Happy holidays, whatever you celebrate out there. And the first game of the week is the Vikings at the Saints. So the Saints are without Michael Thomas in this game, like they will be in Week 17 as well. He's on IR. Got Dalvin Cook, Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson are all starts. I played Irv Smith in a semifinal last week over Hayden Hurst. Irv Smith dropped a touchdown, and Hurst caught one. So it was brutal with no Kyle Rudolph. And in a great matchup with the Bears, Irv Smith only had 3 catches for 37 yards. Not too bad. Would have had a really nice 12 half PPR fantasy day if he had caught that touchdown. But that's the tight end position outside of the top 4 guys. Pretty much it's a touchdown or bust position. I'm not playing him this week against the Saints, even if Rudolph is out again. As far as the Saints go, you got Alvin Kamara, who should be a monster in this game with no Michael Thomas. Manny Sanders, only 5 targets last week, 4 catches for 76 yards. But it was definitely... I was definitely expecting more from him with no Michael Thomas, but we saw Sanders and Breeze connect 12 times for 122 yards in Week 5 with no Michael Thomas. And I've said it a bunch of times on this podcast, the Vikings secondary is very young, and I think this Hall of Famer, Drew Brees and Manuel Sanders can get that connection going again. So I think Sanders is a good flex option, and I will be looking at his yardage prop this week. He went over by just 2 yards last week in a tougher matchup than this one. So next one, we got Buccaneers at the Lions. So Ronald Jones is still questionable. I think he's still on the COVID list as well. So most likely he's going to be out. Leonard Fournette, big game with no Ronald Jones last week. 2 touchdowns, 65 yards, 17 touches. I think this week we can play both Buccaneers running backs if they were both play. But if it's just going to be Leonard Fournette, then he should have a monster game. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown, and Gronk. I think we're still starting all 4 of them. Although it definitely seems like you're going to get at least one bust out of the 4 of them every week. So you're kind of playing roulette down. You're playing Tampa Bay roulette, but they all have such big upside. You can't really set them. So DeAndre Swift draws the short stick with the hardest matchup for running backs this week, but he had 19 touches, including 4 catches. On 5 of the 6 running back targets last week for the Lions. The Bucs have given up the second most receptions to running backs, so I think Swift can still be a start in PPR leagues this week. If he can catch another 5 balls, or 4 to 5 balls again, and see 15 carries, maybe he gets one of those goal line carries he gets in the end zone. Marvin Jones has averaged 10 targets a game over the last 6 games now. Another huge game last week with 112 yards and 10 catches with a touchdown. So we're starting him. TJ Hawkinson, the Bucs have allowed the 7th most receptions to tight ends. If for whatever reason you are thinking of sitting TJ Hawkinson, you shouldn't, because he's to me one of those top 3 or 4 guys that you pretty much got to start every week. 49ers at the Cardinals. So Raheem Mostert's on he's questionable. I don't think he's been put back on the IR. Kenny Golladay is still questionable. So 2 names to look for in this matchup. We got Brandon Ayuk, who's averaged 12.5 targets over the last 5 games, 13 last week, had 9 catches and a touchdown, but only 73 yards. I missed his receiving yard prop by 2 yards. But yeah, with no Deebo Samuels, Ayuk is a must start for sure. He and Justin Jefferson are going to continue to slug it out for the rookie of the year. Jeff Wilson, back-to-back games now with a touchdown, 16 carries last week for 60 yards. Him and Mostert were both in and out of the game with some nagging injuries, but if they're active, I think they're both flex plays here. Wilson did not play in week 1 when these two teams played, but Mostert did and had 150 total yards on 19 touches with a touchdown. So whichever one of them looks like they're going to get the majority of the touches come Sunday morning, I think they're the play. Richie James, it looked like he was going to be the number 2 guy with no Debo and no Kittle. He had that wild game back in week 9 with 9 catches on 13 targets for 184 yards and a touchdown. When the 49ers wide receiver group was completely decimated by COVID-19 coronavirus. Richie James did see 7 targets to Kendrick Bourne's 4 last week, but Bourne had 30 more yards and a touchdown than Richie James did. Plus, James lost a fumble, so I would imagine that's got to hurt his outlook for this game. Jordan Reed only caught 2 balls on 5 targets for 18 yards, but he did score. The Cowboys have allowed the 4th fewest receiving yards, and they're tied for the 5th fewest receptions allowed to tight ends. And the Cardinals have been one of the toughest matchups this year. They've given up the 6th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So Jordan Reed will not be making the tight end touchdown ticket. So looking at the Cardinals, DeAndre Hopkins and Kenyon Drake, I think are more so DeAndre obviously, but I think Kenyon Drake's still a start. Chase Edmonds, 66 total yards on 14 total touches with a receiving touchdown last week. He got some extra work with Kenyon Drake getting a little banged up during the game. He left for a couple drives. But the 49ers did just allow Tony Pollard to catch 6 balls for 63 yards last week. So if Drake is not 100% going into this game, which what starting running back is at this point in the season, maybe Edmonds can be a flex for us, at least, a DFS option, but I can't trust him in my championship. Dan Arnold, 54 yards on 3 catches last week, had 2 catches of over 20 yards. He cleared his yardage prop of 15.5 very easily for me. I might take a glance at it this week if it's going to be that low again, but unless I get a good price on it, I'm staying away. The 49ers have allowed the fewest receiving yards to tight ends, so they're going to have to give me a nice low number again for me to be interested in that one. Dolphins at Raiders. We got Mike Gesicki, Devontae Parker, Myles Gaskin, Henry Ruggs. All these guys are questionable going into this game. Savon Ahmed with 122 rushing yards last week on 23 carries. If Gaskins misses this game, Ahmed should be great again. The Raiders have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs this year. Then we got Lynn Bowden, who led the team in targets last week with no Parker or Gesicki. He only had 37 yards, but caught 6 of his 7 targets. If both of these guys miss again, I think Bowden is a decent option again this week. Raiders are in the top 10 in receptions and receiving yards allowed to running backs. I know he's technically a wide receiver, but they kind of use him all over the field. He's definitely deserving of that dual RB wide receiver tag in fantasy football. Plus, he's going to be playing with just a little bit of
revenge.
He was drafted in the 3rd round by the Raiders, but then got cut before the start of the season, which you never really see. So this is a special type of
revenge.
I don't know if we've ever seen a revenge like this from a player. Durham Smythe led the team in yards last week with Gesicki. I really wanted to get in on his yardage prop last week, but neither of the books that I use had one on him coming up to kick off for that game. If Gesicki misses again, he's another guy I'm going to have to look into Sunday morning, see if they have a number available for him. Matt Breida had a couple nice runs last week, but the Dolphins are not really a team that, is going to really distribute touches all that much. They kind of like to just give them all to one guy, and let that guy be the bell cow for the week. For the Raiders, you got Josh Jacobs, Darren Waller, and I think Nelson Aguilar is a start again if Ruggs is out. If he's not, then I think I'm going to stay away from Aguilar, but if there's no Ruggs, I think Aguilar is a decent option. Panthers at the Washington football team. Christian McCaffrey and Antonio Gibson are both questionable. I think McCaffrey's actually got the doubtful tag, which we don't like to see in fantasy football. DJ Moore, Curtis Samuels, and Robbie Anderson. Anderson's still a start for me. Had his worst game of the year last week, but he had 12 targets, the week before, so I'm still starting him. Mike Davis, 14 carries for 60 yards. Not bad last week, but only 2 catches. He had 30 catches over the first 4 games, but only 29 catches in his last 9 games. So that is definitely a part of the offense that has gone away as Curtis Samuels and DJ Moore have gotten more involved. The Washington defense has allowed the 6th fewest fantasy points to running backs. Plus, they're going to be playing hard for their head coach, who's got something on his mind this week.
Revenge.
Ron Rivera, of course, was the head coach of the Panthers for the last 9 games, and I think this Washington team is going to play with a little extra edge to them with their quarterback situation. Dwayne Haskins named a captain going into this year, which is ridiculous. Had that captainship stripped of him because of his time spent with strippers after the last loss without a mask on. So yeah, not even sure who's going to start at quarterback for the Washington football team. J.D. McKissic has a great matchup this week. The Panthers have allowed the 5th most receptions to running backs. If Antonio Gibson misses this game again, I will definitely be looking into McKissic's reception prop. Last week they had it at 3.5, which is a joke, and there really wasn't all that much juice on it. I think it was like minus 128 for it, but 3.5 catches. The dude finished with 9 catches on 10 targets. So he's been one of the most heavily targeted running backs in the league, if not the heaviest targeted running back this year. So a reception prop of 3.5 is just ridiculous. Hopefully they keep it the same. Terry McLaurin, you're starting him. Logan Thomas, I said last week how he has become one of the most consistent tight ends in the league, but he was incredible last week. Led the team in targets with 15, catches with 12, and receiving yards with 101. And what do you know? The Panthers have allowed the 5th most receptions and the 9th most receiving yards to tight ends, so he is another guy to look at his receiving props this week. Colts at Steelers. James Conner is questionable for this game. We got Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines. Tough matchup, but we're starting both of these guys, especially after what Giovanni Bernard did to the Steelers' run D last week. T.Y. Hilton didn't catch a touchdown last week like he did in the 3 games before, but still 71 yards on 4 catches. I think this is a week to sit T.Y., though. Those Steelers corners are just really tough. You got to sit Michael Pittman, only 2 catches in 3 of his last 4 games. Zach Pascal, 2 touchdowns last week, led the team in catches and yards, but I'm not starting him either. I think it's really just running backs or nothing for the Colts. Benny Snell will get the work if James Conner can't play. Snell had over 100 total yards and a touchdown on 18 carries with 3 catches last week. In the 2 games where Conner was out this year, Snell now has exactly 200 total yards with 3 catches in each game. So there's no reason to think if Conner misses this week, Snell won't see a nice healthy dose of work again. But the Colts defense is just so good. I wouldn't count on a big day from Snell. Fantasy football is all about opportunity. So if James Conner is out, Snell is definitely a start, but I'm just not going to expect a big game from him. Deontay Johnson had another 13 targets last week, but turned them into only 59 yards. He has a horrible tendency of doing this, where he sees, double-digit targets and ends up with, under 7 yards per target, which is just pathetic. Continuing to be extremely inefficient this year, but he's getting the targets, so you kind of have to keep starting him. That's the frustrating thing. Same with Juju and the rookie Chase Claypool. They're seeing the targets. It's just their offense has kind of changed over these last 4 or 5 weeks. They've turned into nothing but dink and dunk. It seems like those deep targets have just washed away. Falcons at the Chiefs, an interesting game here. Got Julio Jones, who's still questionable. Not sure if he's going to be able to play. Calvin Ridley, though, 7th 100-plus yard game last week. 9 touchdowns on the year. I drafted him in one of my dynasty leagues, and I just cannot wait to see how good this dude ends up being. Russell Gage, 10 targets last week. Only player for the Falcons with more than 5 targets besides Calvin Ridley last week. So Gage finished with 68 yards and a touchdown. If Julio is out again, I think Gage is definitely a start in what I think is going to end up being a high-scoring game. Hayden Hurst and Ito Smith. I don't know. Hurst has just been so up and down. I've been wrong on him. Seems like every single week. I was so excited to draft him at the beginning of the year, and it's been one of my more frustrating picks because I haven't had it in me to drop him. Although there's been a couple times this year where I probably should have, but just when he starts looking like he's completely done, he goes out and scores like he did last week against one of the tougher teams. So yeah, I'm not even gonna make a call on Hayden Hurst. If you got him, that's your call. Sorry, dude. Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce are obvious starts, but with the injury to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, we're gonna see Le'Veon Bell get some touches this week. He had 15 carries for 62 yards last week. I heard on the broadcast that Andy Reid said about Le'Veon Bell, he's starting to get a feel for his linemen and how they operate, but I'm hoping we get a high rushing yard prop for Le'Veon Bell this week. If it's something crazy like 70 to 75 yards, I'm going to seriously consider the under. The Falcons are one of the two teams that have allowed less than 1,000 rushing yards to running backs total this year. Which is pretty damn good. Plus, Darrell Williams, I think, is still going to see his fair share of touches. I don't think they're going to just go out there and give Le'Veon Bell 20-plus carries. I would still start Bell no matter what because it definitely looks like Clyde's going to miss this game. But just as far as a prop betting perspective, I'm not going to expect anything crazy from this running game. I think it's going to be a Patrick Mahomes game for sure. Bears at the Jaguars. Me and all my fellow miserable Jets fans out there, we're really hoping the Jaguars can pull out a home victory here, but James Robinson's questionable. Apparently he looks like he's going to play, but we just don't know for sure. David Montgomery has been on fire lately, over 550 total yards in his last 4 games combined. The Jaguars have allowed the 3rd most rushing yards this year, so fire up David Montgomery once again this week. Allen Robinson, only 3rd time this season with under 5 catches last week. Still put up 83 yards. We're still obviously playing him. Darrell Mooney, or Mooney, however you pronounce his name. Back-to-back games with a touchdown now. Only 3 teams have allowed more wide receiver touchdowns this year than the Jaguars. So I think Mooney is a pretty decent DFS option this week. I am very aggravated with myself. I drafted Anthony Miller in one of my dynasty leagues this past year. I was very excited about his 3rd year prospect, and it seems like the guy you really want going forward as far as the wide receiver 2 for the Bears goes. I think it's Darrell Mooney, and I saw that somebody picked him up like 2 weeks ago, so I missed out on that opportunity. Jimmy Graham, Cole Kmet each caught 2 passes last week, only 37 yards between the 2 of them, but the Jaguars are the 4th best matchup for tight ends, so again, cheap DFS options for you there. Probably not guys you can confidently play in your championship leagues, but definitely guys you can consider in a daily fantasy lineup. James Robinson left the game early with an ankle injury last week. We've had to wait and see what's up with him. I think if he misses, both DJ Shark and Laviska Shenault become pretty much solid flex options. The Jags will probably just completely abandon the run. I don't see them giving 12-plus touches to Adari Ogunbowale. If Robinson misses, I will also be checking out Gardner Minshew's pass attempt prop. Tyler Eifert has the best matchup in this game. The Bears are tied for the 3rd most fantasy points allowed to tight ends. And if Irv Friggin Smith had caught the touchdown last week, the Bears would be tied for 2nd. But that's all right. You can't win every league. But yeah, the Bears, 2nd most receptions and the 4th most receiving yards allowed to tight ends. So Eifert might make the tight end touchdown ticket this week. Hopefully we can hit on one for, I think I've only hit on one this season, although I waited way too long to start it. I wanted to start doing it after like week 5, and I waited until I think week 9 or week 10 like an idiot. I had so much success with it last week. I don't know what got into me, but David Montgomery in this game, or David Johnson, sorry. I skipped a page in notes there. Yeah, my bad. Bengals at Texans. We got Duke Johnson and Tyler Boyd, both questionable going into this game. Giovanni Bernard played great against the Steelers. 97 total yards with a pair of touchdowns. That Texans run D has or has allowed the most rushing yards and 17 rushing touchdowns this year. So as long as Mixon doesn't return, which does not look very likely, Bernard should be a very solid flex option, if not an RB2 this week, especially if the Bengals continue to have their third string QB running the ball. Ryan Finley, 47 yards on 10 rushing attempts last week. So we see it with these QBs that pose a threat with their legs. It helps the running backs. Giovanni Bernard is someone I'm very interested in as far as scoring this week. I can't start any of the Bengals wide receivers right now. Even if Boyd misses, I'm still not going to consider playing T. Higgins. Maybe he's a guy I'll look at for his reception prop if Tyler Boyd misses, but even that's sketchy because I can't see the Bengals, or I kind of just see the Bengals just running the living hell out of the ball this week. They had so much success with it last week. Why get away from it? David Johnson had caught all 11 of his targets last week. He hadn't had a game this year with more than 4 targets, and he got 11 last week, which is pretty crazy. It will be very interesting to see if the Texans try to continue that, although the Bengals have allowed the 5th most rushing yards to running backs. They have allowed the 5th fewest receptions and the 6th fewest receiving yards to running backs this year. So they're much more vulnerable to the ground game as far as running backs go. If Duke Johnson does not return to action this week, I would definitely start David Johnson again. But if they're both active, it's going to be a tough call because Houston is second to last in rushing attempts per game. They just don't run the ball very often, and that's including Deshaun Watson's 5 or 6 rushing attempts per game. You take that out, and they're by far the most pass-heavy team in the league. Brandon Cooks, Kiki Kuti each had 7 targets, but Kiki caught the touchdown. That's back-to-back games now with a touchdown for him. They each had between 50 and 60 yards, along with Chad Henson, who also scored. I guess these guys are flex options. The Bengals have allowed the 5th highest explosive pass rate against wide receivers, so it wouldn't be surprising if these guys were to get behind the defense for 1 or 2 deep balls, but I can't trust either of them in my fantasy championship. The one interesting play for me in this game is Jordan Akins. Great matchup. Bengals have allowed the 3rd most receiving yards to tight ends, 7 touchdowns allowed this year. Akins he had 6 targets in 3 of his last 5 games. Hasn't scored a touchdown since week 1, so he might not make the tight end touchdown ticket, but I will be looking at his yardage prop for sure. Giants at Ravens. Wayne Gallman only got half of the carries last week. Alfred Morris has really hampered Gallman from being a legit starter. I'm staying away from him and the entire Giants team, to be completely honest. I think this is going to be a beat down by the Ravens here. J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Mark Andrews, all must starts. Marquise Brown, 98 yards last week on 6 catches. Only the second time this year that he had 6 catches. Only 3 after 3 straight weeks with a touchdown now. But if the Giants have allowed the 4th fewest explosive plays to wide receivers, so this might be the week to get away from Marquise Brown. Dez Bryant caught his first touchdown in like 3 years last week, which is great for him, but really means nothing for fantasy football. It does give Lamar another option to throw the ball to, I guess, but Dez Bryant, let's be real. Browns at the Jets. Hunt, Chubb, Landry. I hit on Jarvis Landry's reception prop for the 4th game in a row now last week. The Jets are 4th in receptions allowed to wide receivers. So if FanDuel is going to continue to set his reception prop at 4.5, I will have to take it again. The Jets are the worst team at defending tight ends. So I'm sure one of Austin Hooper, Harrison Bryant, or David Njoku, if not 2 of them, is probably going to score this week, but I won't be taking any of them on the touchdown tight end ticket. It's just too random with those 3 guys. Frank Gore set his season high for touches last week in that massive upset over the Rams. The Browns are an average run D, so could I see Gore having another decent game? Yeah, but can't start him. Jamison Crowder, 6 catches on 8 targets for 66 yards last week, but he had 7 yards on 2 catches against Seattle when they were trailing the entire game. So he's become way too inconsistent for me to trust. We're a long way away from those 4 straight double-digit target games to start the season for Jamison Crowder. Ty Johnson caught all 6 of his targets last week for 80 yards and a touchdown. I'm not starting him, but I think he's an interesting add in Dynasty. I'm sure the Jets are going to go out and get themselves another running back. I highly doubt Frank Gore is going to be back again. They got P. Ryan, who they just drafted. They got this kid. But yeah, Ty Johnson has looked pretty good, actually, considering the team that he plays on. Broncos at Chargers. So Keenan Allen is questionable. He kind of screwed everybody last week, but Melvin Gordon has clearly been the better back between him and Phillip Lindsay. But the Broncos just keep inexplicably splitting the carries here. I don't understand it. If I had Melvin Gordon, I would try to get away from him in my lineup. I would try and get him in my lineup if it's at all possible. Not only because it's not a bad matchup here, but also because
revenge.
Yeah, obviously he played first, 5 or 6 years with the Chargers. Noah Fant has the best matchup in this game. He left the game in week 14 with an illness, but he returned last week against the Bills on Saturday night and had a great game. He hit his season high in targets and catches with 8 of 11, 68 yards and a touchdown. The Chargers are tied with the Bears for the third most touchdowns allowed to tight ends, so he will definitely make the tight end touchdown ticket this week. Jerry Jeudy led the team in targets when he played the Chargers in week 8, but he only had 4 catches on 14 targets over the last 4 games, so he can't be trusted. Tim Patrick, 3 fantasy points last week, 11 and 18 in weeks 14 and 13. Then he had 0 fantasy points in week 12. 14 and a half in week 11. He's just all over the place, man. So he's just another super inconsistent player that I can't trust. And then KJ Hamler has only caught 53% of his targets, which is actually 8 percentage points higher than Jerry Jeudy. So all these dudes are just super risky. I'm not playing any Bronco wide receivers. We're playing Austin Eckler, obviously, and then Keenan Allen is going to be a tough guy to trust after last week. He was hyping himself up before the game, telling his fantasy owners not to worry about his injury, and then he played a whopping 36% of the snaps, only caught 1 pass for 17 yards, but he's got 15 catches for 135 yards and 2 touchdowns in his last 2 games against Denver. So I'm glad I don't have to make this decision, but if I did, if he's active, I'm playing him. He's coming off of the 10 days rest now. Could he go out in the first quarter and catch 1 ball and hit the bench for the rest of the game? Sure. But he could also go out and catch 10 passes for 120 yards and score as well. The dude has double-digit targets in all but 4 games this year. He's scored in 8 games, over 100 yards in 4 games. If you got to the championship with Keenan Allen, you're starting him. Don't get crazy because of 1 bad game. Hunter Henry had his best game of the year with 15 half PPR fantasy points last week. The Broncos are 8th in fantasy points allowed to tight ends, but he's been one of the he's been one of the more consistent tight ends this year. I have him in one of my 2 championship leagues, and I'm playing him over Mike Gesicki and Cole Kmet. Mike Williams would be a great start if Keenan Allen misses, but Williams has been dealing with some injuries himself, so I'm going to avoid him as well. How many more games we got here? Jeez, sorry guys. I'm dragging ass today. We got the Eagles at the Cowboys. Zeke Elliott's questionable. I think I actually saw he might even already be out for this game. Miles Sanders is a must start this week. The Cowboys have allowed the 2nd most rushing yards and the 4th most rushing touchdowns to running backs. Sanders with 225 total yards in the last 2 games with Jalen Hurts at quarterback. So play Miles Sanders. One prop I will be looking at is his under in receiving yards, actually, with Miles Sanders. Cowboys have allowed the 2nd fewest receptions and receiving yards to running backs, and Sanders has been pretty inconsistent with his receiving numbers. He's got 3 games with under 10 receiving yards. One of them was a -6 receiving yard game. Then he has 4 games with between 10 and 20 yards, 2 games with between 20 and 30 yards, and those 2 games were his last 2 games. And then the 1 high water mark game of 36 yards all the way back in week 2. So I want to see what it's set at. I'm hoping for a 22, 23 yard prop, and I will be looking at the under, especially if it's at plus money. Dallas Goedert has 3 touchdowns and a 9-catch, 91-yard game in his 5-year career against the Cowboys, the team that he's named after. So we're definitely playing him. And then you got Jalen Reagor, had his season high in targets and catches last week, 49 yards on 5 catches. But he's had his playing time reduced, playing less snaps over the last few weeks with Alshon Jeffrey playing more. Rager played on 88% of the snaps in week 10 and 93% in week 11, but he's only played on average 63% over the last 4 weeks, only 55% last week. Very strange last week that he saw his highest target share in the same game that he had his fewest percentage of offensive snaps. He's 6th on the team in red zone targets, only the 1 touchdown this year, and still hasn't had a game with over 55 yards. So I'm not playing him, but I am excited about him next year. I have him in one of my dynasty leagues, and wide receiver is definitely my weakest position, so I'm very hopeful on him. Alshon Jeffrey, nice to see him back, but he's got nothing left. Don't even consider starting him, even against this horrible Cowboys secondary. The Eagles just gave up a 400 passing yard game to Kyler Murray and 169 to DeAndre Hopkins. So if you're an Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb owner, there's that. Tony Pollard had a great game with no Zeke last week. If Zeke misses again, Pollard is definitely a must start. And you got Dalton Schultz. He's either a tight end or at least 4 catches in 6 of his last 7 games. So he's been pretty consistent lately as far as the tight end standard goes. Eagles are 9th in fantasy points allowed to tight ends. So Schultz has a pretty decent shot to make the tight end touchdown ticket this week. Michael Gallup has a touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games, but he's been the most wildly inconsistent of all the Cowboy wide receivers, so I can't trust him. Rams at Seahawks. Very excited about this game. Cam Akers is already out. I added Cam Akers in a few weeks ago in both of the championship leagues. Only started him in one of the leagues last week. That league is weird, and we play each playoff matchup is actually over the course of 2 weeks. So Akers, 4 points last week, didn't officially kill me, but I'm now down like 40 points going into this last week. But I was able to pick up Darrell Henderson. I will have to decide whether to play him over Kenyon Drake or Kareem Hunt. He probably won't make my lineups with the Seahawks allowing the 3rd fewest rushing yards to running backs this year, but Seattle has given up the 2nd most receptions to running backs. So Malcolm Brown has seen the most targets of the 3 Rams running backs. The position has a 13% target share this year. When the Rams won back in week 10 by 7 points, they only threw the ball to their running backs 3 times, and Malcolm Brown saw 2 of those 3. So I will be taking a look at Malcolm Brown's receiving props. If I can get his receptions at 1.5, or dare I say even half, I will definitely be taking the over. Robert Woods scored again last week and gave you a nice little 40-yard run. It's a nice little boost of 4 fantasy points. I'm sure he will get at least 1 or 2 carries this game with Akers out. He only had 33 yards in week 10, but he's had a touchdown or at least 89 yards in 4 of his last 5 games against Seattle, so I'm not worried about Woods. I cannot say the same about Cooper Kupp, however. He scored last week against the Jets for the first time since week 4, but only 39 yards again against the Jets. He's caught all 5 of his targets in each of the last 2 games, but on average only 46.5 yards per game over the last 4. Seattle's pass defense was terrible in the first half of the year, but they've really turned it around. Amazing what a player like Jamal Adams can do for a defense. I'm glad I don't have to decide whether or not to play Cooper Kupp, but if I do, I wouldn't blame you for wanting to sit him. Tyler Higbee scored against the Jets last week, had him on the tight end touchdown ticket, and he had a pretty solid game against Seattle in week 10, 3 catches for 60 yards. I don't think Jamal Adams covers tight ends for Seattle like he did against the Jets, but I don't think I'm going to test my luck with Higbee this week. He's playing a pretty consistent 85% of the snaps this year, so he'll get his targets, but I would just look elsewhere at tight end this week. Chris Carson and DK Metcalf are still must-starts if you ask me, but it's not going to be easy. The Rams' defense is really good. I think they just severely underestimated the Jets last week and got embarrassed. I think the Rams' defense comes out all filled with piss and vinegar, and I expect Aaron Donald to play like a monster. Chris Carson didn't play in the Week 10 matchup, but the Rams have allowed the 6th fewest rushing yards this year. So if I had him, I'm starting him, but he's not an RB1 by any means. DK Metcalf only 43 yards last week on 5 catches. His 3rd lowest scoring fantasy day of the year. His 2nd lowest scoring game was against the Rams in week 6. So he and Jalen Ramsey went at it in that game. I'm expecting much of the same. I'm still starting him in both of my championship leagues, but I'm definitely worried about him. Tyler Lockett, I said last week, he's a ride or die guy because of his massive upside, and I'm sure a lot of people probably rode with him right to a loss. He's really fallen off as of late, only one double-digit fantasy point game since his ridiculous 45-point game against Arizona in Week 7. If you're playing for the championship, I can't blame you for sitting him either because, again, I think the Rams defense is going to play like an angry mob on Sunday. Titans at Packers. We got Derrick Henry. The Packers are tied with the Texans for the third most touchdowns allowed to running backs this year, with 13 of the 18 touchdowns they've allowed coming on the ground. But they're middle of the pack as far as rushing yards allowed, so I'm not expecting a huge 200-yard game or anything, but I think Derrick Henry has a pretty good shot to make the touchdown scorers portion of the Week 16 podcast pick, so stay tuned there. A.J. Brown and Corey Davis are must-starts with Ryan Tannehill playing as well as he is. Corey Davis is making his case for fantasy MVP with his 110 yards and a touchdown last week. Jonnu Smith, not a start for me. Packers have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to tight ends this year. Darrington Evans had 8 carries and caught both of his 2 targets last week. His first targets of the year. You had to know when the Titans used a 3rd-round pick on him this past draft, he would eventually get some work to take some of this load off of Derrick Henry. And I think we're going to start seeing that here in Week 16 and in Week 17 again, coming off a 10-touch performance last week with 57 total yards and a touchdown. The Packers have given up the 2nd most receiving yards to running backs this year, and they're tied for the 2nd most receiving touchdowns. So Darrington Evans might be a really nice high upside DFS play this week that I'm sure is going to be on the cheaper side. The Titans have also allowed a boatload of rushing touchdowns, 12 on the season. So Aaron Jones should have another good game. That league that the championship goes over the course of 2 weeks, I'm playing against Tannehill and Aaron Jones, who scored a combined 60 points last week against me. So that league is pretty much over. Devontae Adams obviously must start, and Robert Tonyan, another touchdown last week, 5 straight games with a touchdown now. The Titans have allowed 7 touchdowns to tight ends this year, so I'm playing Tonyan again for sure. And last but not least, thank God, my throat is killing me. We got Zach Moss, 81 yards on 13 carries in Denver last week. He's a start for me against the Patriots defense that's allowed the 6th most rushing yards this year. Stephon Diggs and Cole Beasley are both must starts, especially if John Brown's going to miss, and he most likely is going to miss this game. Devin Singletary is a flex option against this defense. Gabriel Davis is interesting. The Patriots have allowed an explosive play to a wide receiver at the 8th highest rate this year. Davis has clearly taken on that deep threat role from John Brown. Only 18 yards last week, but a touchdown in the 3 games before last week. He's an interesting option for DFS as well, in my opinion, but I am not starting him. Dawson Knox had a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games. The Patriots have only allowed 1 touchdown to tight ends this year, so although Knox is very tempting if Tyler Kroft were to miss this game, but the Bills still have 2 other tight ends that have scored this year. They love to throw the ball to their tight ends in the red zone, but I think I'm just staying away from Dawson Knox because it's just too random which one's going to get that red zone target. Jacoby Myers, great game from last week, but who the hell started him? 7 catches on 10 targets for 111 yards, saw 60% of the team's targets. He's been the best start for the Patriots because the Bills have struggled against slot receivers. So if you have Jacoby Myers, if it's a deep league, not a bad option. Sony Michel returned last week and had a pretty solid day, 74 yards on 10 carries, had a handful of nice runs. The Bills are at 12th in fantasy points allowed to running back. So if the Patriots can keep it close, Sony Michel could have a good game again. Their first game in Week 8 was a close game, so I don't know. In a deep non-PPR league, I think Sony Michel can be a usable player. James White, only 3 games this year with over 10.5 PPR fantasy points, only 5 games this year with over 7, and has yet to score this year. So I have 0 interest in James White. So that's going to do it for the game previews here in championship week. I'm sorry I'm going a little over, but I wanted to really dive in this week and get as much information on everybody as I could. So let's check out the Week 16 podcast picks. All right, so last week in week 15, I went 7-2. Thank you very much. Trying to finish it out strong here. So let's get into the week 16 podcast picks here. My first pick against the spread is going to be the Eagles -2.5. They're coming off of a crazy game with the Cardinals. Jalen Hurts had over 300 yards passing with 3 touchdowns. He also had 60 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. The Cowboys are atrocious against the run. I think Miles Sanders has a big day here. I think the Eagles defense plays well against Andy Dalton, so I like the Eagles only giving 2.5 points here. I got the Ravens -10.5. I seem to get every single call involving the Giants wrong this year, but I'm going to go with the Ravens. They look like they're starting to put it all together at the right time. 3 straight wins since that weird Wednesday afternoon loss to the Steelers where half the team had COVID. They put a beat down on Dallas. Then they had that wild Monday night game against Cleveland. Game of the year, if you ask me. There was like 7 lead changes in that game. And now they're coming off of a 26-point win against Jacksonville. Lamar has 4 rushing touchdowns in his last 3 games. Mark Andrews has gotten his swag back with 4 big games in a row now. The Giants could only muster 3 points against this Cleveland defense that we saw Baltimore put up 47 against the week before. The Ravens have scored on average 11.5 more points per game this year than the Giants, 30.3 more points per game over the last 3. So I think we got the makings of another beatdown here for the Ravens. So give me the Ravens -10.5. Big point spread, but I don't care. Then the third game against the spread, the Chiefs -10.5. I'm taking the 2 highest spreads of the week is a little sketchy, but I feel like the Chiefs are going to murder the Falcons here. Atlanta has the second best rushing defense right now, but they've allowed the second most passing yards per game and the third most completions per game. With Clyde Edwards-Helaire doubtful for this game and with Le'Veon Bell's best days behind him, I think Mahomes is going to throw the ball 50 times, and just dominate the Falcons. It's a ridiculous thing to bet on, but the Chiefs haven't had a blowout win in a very long time now. I think they're due for one of those big, mop 'em up kind of games. The Chiefs have an average winning margin of only like 4 points over the last 6 games, but I think they break the trend here, and I think they cover this big 10.5 point spread. Atlanta has allowed the most explosive plays to wide receivers this year. Not a good thing when you got Tyreek Hill and McCole Hardman and those boys coming into town. No, actually, it's in Kansas City, which is even better. Atlanta is in the top 6 in fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Also, not a very good position to be in when you have one of the best tight ends of all time playing you in Travis Kelce. I think the deck is very much stacked against Atlanta, so I'm taking the Chiefs to win by at least 11 at home. The over I like for week 16 is going to be the Falcons and the Chiefs, over 54.5. I usually try and stay away from taking an over or an under along with one of the teams, one of the picks against the spread, but this is the over I like the best this week, so I'm going to go with it. The Chiefs have scored 31 points a game this year. Falcons are at 25. This total is the second highest total of the week, so Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game as well. Usually I'd be afraid of taking an over involving a dome team on the road, but as of right now, there's a 4% chance of rain in Kansas City on Sunday, and it should be about 50 degrees, which is as good as you can ask for in December 27th. So the Falcons' run defense is really good, but their pass defense is terrible. I mentioned on the Chiefs pick, I think Mahomes is going to have a big game. I think the Chiefs score at least 30 points on the Falcons' defense here, and I think Atlanta can contribute enough to the over. Kansas City has allowed 24 or more points in 5 of their last 6 games, so I like this game to be a 35-21, 35-24 kind of game. The home team total is set at 33.5 right now. I see the Chiefs maybe even putting up a 40 burger, so that's another one I might consider. Maybe do a little 3-leg same game parlay if your book allows. If you're gonna do that, if I'm gonna do that, I would probably buy the total down to maybe 51.5. Buy yourself a field goal there. The spread down to 9.5, so you only have to win by 10 rather than 10 and the hook. And take the Chiefs over 33.5 on their team total as well. If you really want to get crazy, maybe throw Travis Kelce anytime touchdown in there too. The Falcons were the best matchup for tight ends before the Jets took that spot away from them, giving up like 50 fantasy points to Darren Waller a couple weeks ago. And with the Falcons' run D being so tough, you got to figure that Kelce's going to be the guy down there in the red zone. Maybe Tyreek Hill receiving yards over too. I don't know. But, yeah, that's the over I like for week 16. My under for the week is going to be the Rams and the Seahawks, under 47.5. Seattle has only allowed 11 points per game over the last 3. LA only 18 points a game over the last 3. So both defenses have been playing great. Yes, the Rams did just lose to the Jets, but like I said in the preview of this game, I think the Rams D is going to be in a very different mindset for this game. I think they're going to be playing like a bunch of crazed dogs out there. The Rams are going to be without their best running back, Cam Akers, so I think that's going to hurt their offensive output. I think this is going to be a low-scoring game, so I got the Rams at the Seahawks under 47.5. My TD scores this week, it was actually really hard to narrow it down to just 3 because there's a lot of guys I like. But Ronald Jones is in line for all of the work again this week against the Lions, who have allowed by far the most touchdowns to running backs this year. Bruce Arians said the other day that Ronald Jones doesn't seem like he's going to be available with his finger injury and the COVID issue. Leonard Fournette scored twice last week against Atlanta, one of those best run Ds in the league, so he should have a great game against these Lions. My next one is Miles Sanders. Against the Cowboys, they have also given up a boatload of rushing TDs this year. Sanders has been playing much better since the QB change. I like Sanders to get in the end zone here this week. We'll be very much rooting for the Eagles this week. And then I got Derrick Henry. I kind of feel bad about taking this one because it's, he comes with such a high price tag. You got to eat a lot of chalk for this bet, but he's playing Green Bay, who suck against the run. 3rd most touchdowns allowed to running backs. Henry is tied with Dalvin Cook for the most TDs in the league right now with 15. I can't say no to the low-hanging fruit that is the Derrick Henry touchdown prop. I was going to go with David Montgomery because of his 6 touchdowns over the last 4 games playing the Jags, who are right up there with the Packers and the Cowboys and the Texans as far as being atrocious against the run. I also really like the Dolphins running backs to score against those Texans. I just don't know which one is going to get the lion's share of the work between Gaskins and Salvon Ahmed. Who's going to get the goal line touches? Who's going to get those receptions? I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if both of them score, actually. So there's a couple other options for you if you can't get behind the high price tag of Derrick Henry. And last but not least, we got our Week 16 Road Dog of the Week.
Oh, you didn't know? Your ass better call somebody.
My road dog of the week. Usually the road dog is like the last pick that I come up with when I'm trying to put together this segment for the podcast, but for whatever reason this week, when I started looking through all the road teams getting points, this was the one that stood out to me the most. I got Cincinnati Bengals at the Texans getting 8 points. I know this could be a massive letdown spot for the Bengals coming off that huge upset over the Steelers, but it was the way that they won that's the most encouraging for me as far as this bet goes. Giovanni Bernard had 83 yards on 25 carries with a touchdown against the Steelers, one of the best run Ds in the league. Ryan Finley also had those 47 rushing yards. You look at how the Bengals finished up the season last year. Joe Mixon averaged over 25 touches a game. So I think we see another heavy workload game for Giovanni Bernard here. I think it's something that the head coach wants to do. They're in let's just get this season over with mode. Let's just run the ball. And when you have a matchup like this against the Texans, who have allowed the most scrimmage yards to running backs this year, how can you get away from the run? The Texans offense has been slowly declining pretty much all season. I think last week's fumble at the goal line to lose the game, which was like the second or third time that has happened to them this year. I don't think the Texans have it in them to take a big lead and to keep it. So give me the Cardiac Cats, the Cincinnati Bengals, +8 as the road dog of the week for Week 16. And that's going to do it for the Week 16 episode of the Kicking or Sticking Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in this year. Thanks for checking out this episode. Hope everybody has a happy, safe holiday. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin' or Stickin' is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin' or Stickin' is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.